Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Welcome to Community Dialogues. It's about showcasing and profiling people who have, especially communicators who have ventured on the path less taken. And before we move on, let me just kind of introduce to the audience. Mike is an internal and social communications consultant focused on enabling communication leaders to make a bigger difference in their organizations and communities. His specific areas of interest are measurement, influence, segmentation, and leadership. He's a thought leader and has many industry leading initiatives to his credit. The latest being taking over as editor in chief of Strategic. He is a founder of We Lead Comms community that has over 22,000 followers across the world on LinkedIn. It is a program to recognize initiative, courage, and leadership in the communication profession. He takes great pride in playing the role of a super connector within the communications industry, sharing profiles of communication leaders through the We Lead Comms initiative and facilitating mutually beneficial introductions. He has authored From Lincoln to LinkedIn, the 55-minute guide to social communication, a manual and mobilizing peer-to-peer communication in communities and organizations. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for joining us for the Community Dialogues podcast episode today.
It's my pleasure. I mean, having hosted you for a podcast recently, it's nice to be on the other side of the microphone.
Thank you, Mike. And I'm sure that especially the will and the interest that you bring along with you in connecting people, connecting communication professionals, I think is exactly the right kind of intervention that the communicators need world over, because the world is getting smaller. And as the world is getting smaller, the cultures are kind of getting together. So the communication professionals also have the responsibility to explore what does a connected world looks like in terms of communications mandates and communications domain. Today, the topic we are discussing is evolving role of internal communications in driving culture globally. And we will discuss this aspect from different ways. So Mike, let me throw up a first question for you, and which I kind of take from your own blog writing is,
Sure.
and especially from the profile, it says challenging traditional communication thinking and creating simpler database solutions. If you can elaborate on it, especially on the part of traditional communication thinking, that would be great. From there, we can pick up.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing about traditional communication thinking, particularly when it comes to internal communication, is that many people see it as a box ticking exercise. It's something to say, okay, I've told people what to do, now they're expecting them to do it. And the reality is that there's so much for time, for attention, resources. An organization isn't just simply competing for customers. It's also competing for the prioritization of its employees, and particularly the prioritization of its managers. Because in organizations, to a large extent, managers drive the behavior that they're incentivized on. And if they're incentivized on something that's not aligned with what you say the priorities are, then you've got a situation where misalignment can occur, where ultimately employees are more likely to do what their manager says is important than what the company says is important if there's a conflict between the two. And so the traditional thinking that you can just say, do this and expect it to happen is becoming decreasingly viable. And that's a lot of what I talk to people in internal comms and people in management about, that, and it's not even just having it be more two-way. It's about recognizing that it's multi-directional. People aren't just listening to your emails and to your town halls. They're listening to each other more than they're listening to you. And you've got to find a way to tap into the day-to-day conversation that's going on in the organization.
Right. I think something you have mentioned something very important here, of the traditional way of directing people and people doing it. So that is where the organizations are, or the people are kind of getting away from. Second aspect that you mentioned was multi-directional, that the people like the colleagues and employees and leadership all are actually learning and knowing about each other and from each other about the company from many platforms. So kind of that has led to many ways in which message flows. Uh,
Correct.
yeah. So important part here is that do you think it's because of the generational changes that is happening, and doesn't it then actually makes communication a little more, uh, for the lack of better word, uncontrollable? Uncontrollable is not the right word actually, but spread out so much that it's difficult to know where it starts from, where it ends, who are the stakeholders, who are the actually the person responsible for it. So, what do you have to say about the chaos or the confusion it creates?
Well, I think chaos and confusion is a choice.
Hmm.
It's actually fairly easy to identify the influencers, identify the stakeholders, and prioritize the messages. It's fairly easy to do it, but you need to have, a rigorous way of doing these things. I mean, there are two established methodologies for identifying internal influencers: snowball analysis and organizational network analysis. Snowball analysis is something that somebody could be trained to do in a couple of hours. Organizational network analysis is a bit more expensive and a bit more thorough, but it produces something that's even more valuable, which is, instead of a list of all the influencers, it actually produces this map of how they all connect with each other. Either of these is an improvement over the current approach, which is either to just think you know who the influencers are, or to treat everybody equal. So it's a choice. A lot of organizations choose not to do it because they're afraid of what the results are going to show, particularly in terms of middle management, because a lot of people in middle management aren't particularly well networked for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which is that a lot of people in middle management are promoted because of their technical expertise and not their leadership skills, or not the extent to which they have initiative to connect with and amplify and interact with other people at peer level in the business. So, and part of it, if you're talking about the generational piece, particularly in India, there's a whole relationship with hierarchy that is starting to unravel as the younger and younger generations are coming in.
Yes.
That you have and there's a wonderful book on this by my friend Mark Hannon called Midnight's Grandchildren. Mark is who I've introduced you to. He's an Englishman who's basically been working in India for the last 20
Yes.
years and has been able to bring some outsider insights into an analysis of Indian culture, that historically Indian enterprises have been built with a reverence for hierarchy. But young Indians lack this reverence for hierarchy, and then they're coming into these businesses, and there's a near total disconnect between what mobilizes, particularly ambitious young people in business, and what drives the need of people, particularly in at upper middle levels of the hierarchy, for control and security. So, this is an issue that needs to be addressed consciously. And these tools and techniques, influencer analysis, snowball analysis, organizational network analysis, can provide, an amazing amount of insight and reduce the friction that this cultural conflict is creating.
This brings me to two questions, but I'll put them one by one. Number one, you
Sure.
said there are multiple methods in which we can figure out and actually measure the impact and the influence, or where actually how does the message flowing. We can do
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a perspective, and because we are talking about communication practices globally, so there is in India usually, while everybody wants measurement, but companies are not able to take up the tools or the processes or new tools on measurement because of the budget constraints. Like India is still yet to grow on many aspects of communication measurement internally. Not that the tools are not there, but that's a problem. But you also mentioned that globally companies don't take this up. Is it again their issue is also budget, or what is the reason?
Budget is a convenient excuse not to do something, as is, insecurity in the global environment. That's another convenient excuse not to do things. The reality is that a lot of effective measurement tools require no additional budget. What they do require is a certain degree of will for the organization to be willing to examine a certain issue, like, for instance, the extent to which its management is connected with each other or is isolated from each other, and the extent to which teams are connected or isolated. This is not a massive amount of investment that's involved. Similarly, it's, if you're a communication leader, there's nothing to stop you from, asking 20, 30 people, what are the top three priorities facing your organization? What are the three biggest things you're working on in your job? Is that going to give you a definitive, statistically valid view of what's going on in the organization? No, but you're not trying to predict the outcome of an election. You're trying to surface, themes and ideas which may not be getting through to management. So if you're asking people, what are the top three priorities facing your organization? And you ask 20 people and 15 people are saying all kinds of stuff that isn't on the mission, vision, or value statement, then you can illustrate that there's a need for a communication effort to bring everybody onto the same page. That doesn't require budget, that requires will.
So, yes, so another aspect that I was wanting to touch upon, while this also threw up a few questions, but I'll kind of go to the second question now. You said there's a lot of middle management people who are not there, who have been in the middle management because of the skills or the skill set that's required, and not for the leadership potential.
Because of the skills that were required for the jobs that they were promoted from. So you've got a lot of great engineers, great accountants, great administrators, administrative people who are now in positions of management. And the key thing about a lot of these people who are in positions of management is A, they're not spending most of the time doing the stuff that they're good at. And B, the organization is depending on them to be good at stuff that they haven't been trained to do.
Right. So,
and then they're pressurized.
Right. And this brings me to other aspect of the internal communication, especially. And I personally believe that while we might think that we are good with communications because we can write well, or we can actually write something, or we can speak well. But generally, there's a need for people at every level to we started being trained on communications, because you cannot make people good in people communication in a day. And as soon as the middle level managers enter, their tryst with people management also starts. What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's an interesting issue. I mean, I was just teaching an executive education course in the Baltic region, and they're dealing with this very question. Where is the line between personal communication, team communication, and business communication at scale? And most businesses need to improve in each of these areas, and most managers need to improve in the first two. Managers don't to be able to, to segment the corporate audience. That's what a communication professional is for. Communication professional is really about being able to turn strategy into action at scale. That's, if you're asking about the real value that we bring to the organization, it's that. Now, separately, there's work that needs to be done to drive alignment at team level. There's a tool that a friend of mine that's launched, which is called Mirror, which is a team alignment diagnostic. That's great at team level, but team level communication is a very different ballgame to organizational or functional communication in a large enterprise. And then there's the leadership communication piece, which is really twofold. One is, how do you project and how do you interact as a leader, as someone in authority? And how do you understand the influence that you have, not just in what you say and what you do, but also in what you don't say and what you don't do? There's definitely a need for greater awareness of this, because that actually has reverberations and scale through the business. But I think the key thing, the biggest challenge that we face as a profession is that, unlike law, Somebody can't walk in and say without a law degree, without experience as a lawyer, I'm as good of a lawyer as the lawyers are. But we have plenty of people that we're dealing with who think they're great communicators and think that, our advice is either superfluous or excessively expensive or excessively difficult to deal with. And they think they can do it on their own, or they can ask ChatGPT for a communication plan and expect everything to be all right. The reality is that, if you want to look at the true value of communication as a corporate function, it's a risk management function, every bit as much as it is a leadership function or commercial function. But sometimes we're being measured on, ROI. What's the ROI of a communication initiative? And the really kind of cynical organizations, they want to measure us on our ROI. They want to tell us what the commercial levers are, the commercial or operational levers that drive the P&L. Now, we can look at changes in performance in sales, in operations, in whatever the organization is measuring in terms of the difference it makes towards profitability or optimization. But unless we can measure the extent to which our own activities impact these things, which we need to be able to look at, then it becomes very difficult to demonstrate ROI. And even if we're not talking about ROI, what's the risk? That the CEO says something that's inconsistent with the organization's brand promises. What's the risk of that? Well, if it gets picked up by the media or social media, it could destroy the entire brand.
Yeah.
For the amount of money that a communication function costs, which is negligible in corporate terms. Yeah. A well-resourced communication function is a $1 million function. Most CFOs don't get out of bed for less than $1 million. The bar bill of an executive team at Davos isn't that much lower than that, really. And so trying to justify a 10% return on investment in order to continue a communication function is ludicrous. It's an initiative test. It's not meaningful financially from an organization perspective, but from a risk perspective, if you're willing to, and this is one of the great stories that came in my podcast before I had you on, the conversation I had with Darren Briggs in episode 1. His conversation was, you've got $1 billion change program on your hands, $1 billion change program on your hands. Do you want to trust its success to a bunch of people whose main job is to put out PowerPoint slides?
True. You touched upon something very interesting, which is a team level organizational communication. Why I think it's very interesting it's on two levels. Number one, organizationally, it has been proven that the most amount of influence that anybody has on an individual is the direct line manager. There's to such an extent that there are sayings that people don't leave companies, they leave bosses in colloquial terms.
Yes, I would say that more people leave bad bosses than leave bad companies, but there is two-way traffic as well. But I definitely see your point. The relationship with the line manager is absolutely crucial. Where I see communication people causing more problems in this area is that because we believe that the line manager is the most important communicator, we try to put as many communication tasks on the line manager as we can. And this overburdens the line manager, because the line manager, A, isn't necessarily trained as a communicator, and B, we're not the only function who are pulling up their strengths. Finance, operations, safety, risk management, human resources, all of these functions all know that the line manager is key. And so the line manager, who, as we talked about, comes into a job because they're a really good accountant or they're a really good engineer, is having to do all of this extra work who's got to deal with all of these burdens and deliver the results of their team.
Yeah.
So at what point does that line manager deprioritize your agenda?
Yeah.
The paradox is, even though the line manager is the most important, has the most important communication role in an organization on average, we need to use that as little as possible or as little as necessary, so that we're not creating communication as a burden for line management. Because I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of line manager focused communication doesn't work.
So this is also in my view, and I would like to get some guidance and learning from you here on this. This is one element of IC which is a little unsolved. Like overall organizational communications, you are still able to do with a lot of channels. There's a lot of measurement tools also available with the organizational communication. You can track the intranet, you can track the mailers, you can track many other things. How do you influence this aspect where the and that has the biggest influence, which is the line manager subordinate communication? How do you ensure that that goes in alignment of with the organizational conversation?
As you were asking, you seem to be asking two questions. One is the extent to which communication generally can be measured, but two, the extent to which the effectiveness of line manager communication can be measured. The effectiveness of line manager communication is more difficult to measure because most line manager communication takes place in conversation offline between line managers and employees, in briefings or in one-to-one conversations or chats, emails, what have you. And then there's the issue of whether the line manager communication is aligned with the overall prioritization, the mission, the vision, whatever your architecture is of saying this is the direction in which the company's going. I like to use qualitative research. I like to go in and ask people, again, as I said before, what are the top three priorities facing the organization? What are the top three priorities facing you in doing your job? Because you want to start with, okay, here's what the company says its priorities are. Then you look at senior managers and here's how they look. Then you look at a group of line managers and see how they look at priorities. And then you look at a group of rank and file employees and you see how they look at priorities. Inevitably, there's going to be some variation. And so then by identifying what that variation is, the leadership of the organization can either change what the stated values are or change their behavior and change their incentives to move the organization towards its stated behaviors and values. But you can't do this unless you've got some degree of openness around the gap between those three things. If the organization isn't willing to consider that its managers are driving to a different agenda than the mission and value architecture, then you can't have an honest conversation about this. So my invitation is do this ask these two basic questions, rigorously, repeatedly to small groups of people within the business and track the direction in which this stuff is going. Because that gives you some power to adjust it without having to overly pressurize the organization.
Thank you. Now, as we touch upon, so because just touch upon the line managers about relationship, I feel the coming time is going to be tougher for organizations across the world. And for multiple reasons. It is like on one hand, you have very, very vulnerable geopolitical, geoeconomic situations. On another hand, you have technology, which is kind of shaking up a lot of things, and we don't know what the impact is going to be. There's a lot of the way the world is connected today. It was never that connected that way. So, in many ways, a normal workplace, a normal society is being shaken in its own ways. Things are not similar as they were or people are used to be. And we human beings don't also have a learning gestation period. We don't learn, okay, no, today something comes and tomorrow we just learn it. We also take time to learn. So when there are so many changes happening, a big part of new behaviors, new expectations, new ideas, new ways of adapting work to the workplace and workplace to the work, and also all the societal challenges which are people are going through, anxiety, stress, so many things that now are getting jumbled up because we don't know where it's coming from. And I feel organizations have a large role to play in this area. For a simple reason, employees today are spending almost like 10 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours a day at work. So when there's such a huge involvement from somebody's working day or waking up hours, then of course the responsibility is also huge. How are the organizations getting ready, or do you think, first of all, do you think that organizations are getting ready to wake up to this challenge and keeping the workplace tomorrow ready? And if yes, how? And if no, why do you think they are not?
Let me try to rephrase your question. To a certain
Mhm.
extent, can organizations prepare for a more constructive role in the increasingly complex environment in which they operate? I would hope so, because there's a lot that they can do. Indeed, they're better positioned to help people, both their employees and their customers, navigate through the multidimensional chaos that we're dealing with. I mean, in what you were saying, I identified 5 different strands of uncontrollable activity out there, one of which is geopolitics, one of which is technology change, one of which is demographics, one of which is climate change, and the other is shareholder and stakeholder expectations, particularly around financial returns. So you've got any one of these trends is an overarching macro trend, but we've got all 5 of them increasingly volatile at this particular time. And, particularly the geopolitical stance, given the nature of all of the elections that have taken place in 2024, not just the US election, the Indian election, elections in, British election, the European election. This has been the World Cup elections this year. And we still don't know what the ramifications of all of these moving parts coming together. And that's just the geopolitics. You've got the acceleration of AI. People don't really know the extent to which the direction in which that's going. There's really just a lot of demonstration and experimentation going on. Demographics, the increasing number of young people coming into the workplace, and the challenges, particularly that people in my generation, kind of the upper generation X, if you will, are having, given that we haven't, a lot of us haven't made it to the C-suite, is up or out necessarily the most advantageous way to handle a workforce, and conversely, how can people find their way back into the conversation? That's a huge issue in and of itself. It's something that I'm concerned about. Climate. The impact of the climate. You've got large parts of the world having 50 degrees Celsius temperatures. How can you function in offices or workspaces that aren't air conditioned if for extended periods of time as a human being, if you're operating in 50-degree environment? Again, that's a huge bit. Plus the patterns of droughts and floods that's happening in the world. And then shareholder expectations. Shareholders are expecting constant growth no matter what, despite all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so how do you manage that? Well, organizations are much better set up to manage this stuff and to move forward than either governments or individuals are. And so the issue is whether organizations will actually, acknowledge that this is part of their role. And indeed, this is, a key element of their own ability to survive and thrive, their resilience and their adaptability to all of this. That's going to be as much of a determining factor as whether people like your color or not, or like your products or not. So this is, organizations do need to raise their game. I think there are some that are moving in the right direction. I think, as 2025 sets in and things move in a particular geopolitical direction, I think others will follow suit. I mean, one thing that is becoming increasingly apparent is that people cannot rely either on themselves as individuals or on their governments to deal with any of these different issues. And so either they need to do it collectively or they need to become parts of organizations that are doing this better than others.
What is happening is that it adds on to additional stress and expectation from the organizations to take some stands politically, some stands economically, some stands with respect to human values. So this is turning out to be a cool round, which you don't know which kind of what is being cooked into it and how many people are ready to actually participate in cooking the things they want to cook. So you're right. Now, related to this entire globalization, or rather this connectedness, is the movement of businesses from one geography to another, whereby so in the past also it has happened in the last 50, 60 years, 70 years that we have seen. In many ways, the Western philosophy of management took over. Now it seems that the world is again going through a change and a churn, whereby the future might be about certain companies in the eastern sphere of the world might be kind of developing and building up. What is it that the communication professionals, and I'm talking about this because I know a few companies here who are India-based multinationals, and they are struggling to figure out exactly how to actually build culture communication or develop culture communication, or kind of spread communication around the company narrative with the global audience. What is your recommendation on such aspect? Do you think that communication professionals in one geography can actually build communication narratives in other geography, or do you think it's better to take help of actually the local communication experts? What is your take on overall situation of this?
Well, I think culture and communication operate in parallel. I mean, I think if you're going to try to create a global culture in an organization, particularly if you're doing it through acquisition, is you've got to really understand what the existing cultures that you're acquiring are, whether you're acquiring staff or whether you're acquiring companies. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to accept, the limitations of what you're buying. Culture is malleable. Culture can be influenced. So, and they can be influenced from both directions. The leadership, the ownership can have a strong view about what culture it wants to have. It can hire against those cultural norms. It can train people in the operationalization of cultural values. And it can listen to what are the cultural contexts and frameworks and issues that people have. Now, communication professionals play an utterly critical role in this because we tend to be better in terms of communicating at scale, projecting stuff out. And we also have, access to methodologies and processes and approaches like qualitative research, like quantitative research, like being able to analyze the intranet search data in an organization to figure out what's actually important to people. It's about being at the center of the refinement and the alignment of these things. Because if we're not at the center of it, who's going to be? HR? HR's got its own agenda. Is it going to be marketing? Marketing's got its own agenda. Really, the CEO and the comms function have the most 360-degree view of what's going to be viable and sustainable from that perspective. And so, organizations have to be willing to recognize that you don't dictate a culture in any way that an email doesn't dictate action. But, communication folks, once that realization takes place, that gives communication folks the freedom to try to create some coherence around it, moving people in the right direction.
And do you think that organizational management or the senior management, and I'm asking you because you have a fairly large global experience in terms of multi-geography experience, that the management is does see internal comms role as an influential role or a strategic role that demands and that requires their attention?
I don't think they do necessarily, but I think they can. I think it's up to us to make a case for our involvement in these conversations. both for what we can contribute and the risk that's being taken if we're not involved. This is, just because we're $1 million function in a multi-billion-dollar world doesn't necessarily mean that's the value we add. The value we add is life and death in a lot of organizations.
Yes.
And it's up to us to drive that change in the conversation. C-suite folks have a lot on their plate. Communication is one of dozens of factors. I mean, we're looking at, as I mentioned before, there's 5 global mega trends that are happening. Conversely, a CEO's attention to internal communication may seem peripheral to these things. We need to make them understand that this is actually core, and it's crucial for us to, it's crucial for them to be able to navigate through all of this stuff, to be able to say, okay, here's what we are, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's why we're not doing certain other things. So that A, it's clear, and B, people understand what the story is. And if you do that well, you can reduce a lot of the other chaos that you're dealing with. And that's going to save you billions, not just millions.
I come back to the same question of multinationals, especially for Indian multinationals, or rather Indian multinationals who intend to expand geographically and now exploring different markets, new markets. Well, how do you suggest that they move ahead on this path? I'm not asking for any specific, but overall direction. What do you think when they are acquiring or merging or building their own base in different geographies? How do you think they should move ahead?
Well, I think one thing that they can do, which I think they'd be comfortable with and which would be beneficial, is really do a better job of onboarding international employees into their own culture and mindset. It's not just simply abandoning your culture and mindset and trying to be globally multinational in a generic way. There are reasons why Indian multinationals that have gone abroad have been successful enough to be able to do that. You need to be able to make those principles, visible and embraceable by the people that you bring in from outside of your own culture. I don't buy the idea that there's some generic multinational corporate culture that everybody should ascribe to. I've worked in American companies, Danish, Dutch, etc. National culture is a huge part of it.
Mm.
And every national culture has its pluses and minuses. And the better people are prepared to deal with those things without having to do it on the fly, the less friction you're going to have and the more tolerance you're going to have, particularly from people who are working for you, who live outside of your normal norms and expectations.
And I pose this question a little more specifically to you because you are kind of counterpart in the other geography. How do you think people who want to reach out to you from Indian diaspora, in what ways do you think you can help them? And for what all things can they reach out to you?
Well, I mean, I'm always up for a conversation about particularly internal comms, culture, measurement, really getting people to move in a common direction. And I've been doing this for 35 years in various capacities. I used to run political campaigns before coming into corporate comms. So I'm always up for a conversation about this stuff. My website is www.changingtheterms.com. I'm also very visible on LinkedIn. We Lead Comms, which is an initiative that I launched, which is really about connecting and celebrating the value that communication professionals provide, particularly in the current environment. All you need to do is look at hashtag We Lead Comms on LinkedIn, and you'll find We Lead Comms, and you'll find me. Always up for a conversation. This is an interesting and exciting world. And I mean, particularly the coming success of Indian companies, both, in terms of dealing with their own cultural issues, the intergenerational issues that you talk about, and the international cultural issues that emerging multinationals are going to be dealing with. I'm very interested in working with folks who have those challenges or interests.
Great. So for all the people, for all the communication professionals, corporate communication strategists and heads, I think if by any chance there is a there's an expansion plan, or rather, if you are struggling with a challenge out there in the European market or the West, I think Mike is there to help you, and you can connect with him online. He's a very lively blog chapter as well on his website, and where he updates quite a few relevant topics. Mike, let's move on to something different. Maybe also we are moving towards the end of podcast, so I'll have two questions rather.
Sure.
Uh, One is, so what do you think AI? So there's a lot of talks around AI and communication. Uh, on one hand, there, I at least around me, I see that people have started using ChatGPT, but that's in my view, that proved lethal because it will block the development of communication professionals. But how do you see the growth of AI in communications domain? Do you think some of the people might think that, oh, you know what, will this lead to displacement or substituting the agencies or the service providers in communications with AI, or will it add to opportunities for both?
Well, I think there's a number of issues around AI and its use in communicate in business communication. Aside from the risks involved with dumping your own data into a public AI tool and expecting that data to survive, to continue to be private. I mean, you know, it's literally like taking a suitcase full of money and throwing it into the wind. And organizations are going to be probably increasingly wary of the use of public tools. I think that's a good thing. I think corporate communicators need to be fluent in the uses of AI, particularly in how they, not just in terms of how it can make their job easier, but in also how other people can use AI to bypass them. Um, you know, is AI a good starting point for a communication strategy or a news release, or because these are all use cases where individual managers or individual stakeholders could bypass the professional communication function. We need to be on guard for that. But concurrently, we also need to be a stand against mediocrity in our space, and that means both in terms of doing you know really good work at this time, work that's much better than a machine could do, but also in making the case that, if you're going to use AI to do mission critical, risky stuff, at best, you're going to do it no better than your competition. At best.
Uh,
At worst, you're going to be doing it much worse than organizations that are making the minimal investment required to do this properly and professionally. And so we need to be able to make that case. Um, as a group, we need to be much better organized and much more collectively articulate and about why we need to exist. If not, people will say, I'm going to go with my AI communication plan and I'm going to put it into AI, and AI is going to send it out to everybody, and everybody will have their AI reader read it all. Well, eventually having, machines talking to machines. That's the worst case scenario. But at the end of the day, communication is about mobilizing human effort and human alignment. And if it's machine to machine communication, it's pointless. It's got to be human to human.
True. I think that is where a big message lies for all of us. It's like it's about mobilizing people. Machines cannot think people. People have to think for
Exactly.
people. So
Exactly.
I move on to my last question for today. It is about what do you think makes for a good IC professional? And another and added to this question is how do communication professionals groom themselves into great leaders, communication leaders, and or for that lack of word, IC professionals maybe?
Okay, let me treat these as two separate questions. The first
Yeah.
question is, what are the defining characteristics of a good communication professional, or particularly an internal communication professional?
Yeah.
Um, I think that the key traits are curiosity, agility, and resilience. Curiosity, a willingness to understand what's really going on, particularly in the business, what drives P&L, what drives the risks and opportunities in a business's environment. We need to be as fluent as other leaders in the organization are about those things. We can't just simply be good at generating PowerPoint slides and generating graphic arts. And there's a lot of downward pressure coming in, namely HR departments hiring people on the basis of skills rather than on the basis of intelligence um, or ambition level. And so that's something that we have to deal with, at a macro level within the businesses in which we operate. But in terms of being, a really effective communication professional, curiosity is agility and resilience. And what I'm saying about resilience particularly, it means oftentimes being able to do or willing to do more than 100% of your believed workload in order to buy space for you to do the stuff that's actually, there's a lot of comms people have a never-ending stream of workload requests that come in. And they come in from senior folks, and saying no is not necessarily an answer. Or it's not an answer unless you've got the data to back up the no. And so sometimes you've got to do 100 and 120%, but you've got to be selective about that extra 10 to 20%, because that's where you start to collect the data that proves that the stuff that you're doing is more important than some of the other stuff that's coming in your direction. So you've got to be resilient enough and proactive enough to get control of your situation to the maximum extent possible. That's what I consider the traits of a particularly future-proofable communication professional. Technical skills alone, being a nice person alone, aren't going to cut it. You've got to be curious, resilient, and adaptable and proactive. Now, the second part of your, could you repeat the second part of your question?
The second part was, how can these people groom themselves into becoming great leaders? So while a great communication professional is one aspect, the industry need leader also, because we deal with leaders day in, day out. Our job is to, as an IC professional, our job is to engage with the CEO and the CXOs and actually orient them on the communication side of the business, or rather the culture, the communication, which matters to everybody. So which means we need leaders who can understand the leadership and who can engage with them in the same way, which way leaders feel, oh, he understands what I want to do.
Well, I think there's three dimensions of leadership that we all need to get comfortable with. We all don't need to be, succeed in each of these three dimensions, but we've got to, be aware of them, and we've got to make sure that there are people in each of these categories. One, which I think applies to all of us, is to recognize the leadership element of what we do as communication professionals. There's a lot of this talk about, we don't get taken seriously because we don't have a seat at the table. We have plenty of influence. I like to say we have a hand on the wheel, because what we say, how we say it, and what we have organizations say and not say has a measurable impact on the outcomes that they provide. Just simply through the word choice, through choosing the right spokesperson for a particular issue, for finding the right story that illustrates a behavior. We have a ton of influence on how things actually turn out in organizations, and we need to take ownership of that, first of all. Second, we need to be able to speak the language of the business and demonstrate how our ideas can potentially move the business in a constructive direction more efficiently than other activities do. So we need to compete with other resource, demands in the we need to be able to lead the competition against other resource demands in the organization. And third, We need to take collective action and drive collective conversations about our value and our impact in the organizations and societies in which we operate. Not everyone has to fulfill all of these three roles, but we do need to make sure that all three of these roles are filled properly. And that's part of our own citizenship to the profession, basically.
So, which means that we need to learn the co-harmonious way of existence. That
We
I
need to
bring
learn.
something to table, somebody else brings something to it. Let's respect it. Let's form a community that builds together.
Right, and let's support the communities that are out there. So, like the membership associations, we need to support our membership associates. We need to be paying the dues. We need to be showing up at the conferences. We need to be creating opportunities for people to gather physically and virtually so that we can move these conversations forward. And if other people are doing it, we need to support them. We need, there's no free room for free riders in this space. Either you're taking the initiative to do this stuff, or at least you're supporting it to the maximum extent you can.
Right. So thank you, Mike. I think it was an amazing great conversations with you. I think it was the first podcast, so we touched upon largely on broader topics as well. I think, and as we move forward, maybe we'll get another opportunity to talk, and at that time we'll focus
That
on
would be
much more
outstanding.
focus aspects. But before we leave, I'll just summarize a few things that I learned from your podcast. I think
Sure.
number one is that ask the right questions. It's not about the budgets for measurement. It's about asking the right question and knowing the whys in what we are doing
Yeah.
from communication perspective also and from people's perspective also. Uh, Second aspect I heard again add to that is the basic questions. Basic questions cut it. Just ask them well.
Yeah.
Uh, Third, which I learned is about about stand up against mediocrity, where actually we were talking about AI. I think that's a great responsibility on all the communication leaders, mid-level professionals to groom the young professionals, bring them in alignment with what makes for a great professional, and actually stand up for it, stand up against mediocrity.
Yeah.
And to do that, be curious and be resilient.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So these are the key takeaways. Thank you, Mike. We'll touch base with you again. I'll keep in touch to explore more.
I appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much for having me. I'm interested, if somebody's interested in getting a hold of me, I'm easy to find. And I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Mike. Anybody who wants to get in touch with Mike, the details are available in the podcast below in the description section. Bye bye, Mike. See you soon.
You got it.